time. If you have a phone, silence. This is DBA 2 student Cheri Sides, and she's going to give a dissertation proposal defense on factors affecting economic development. And she's an economist, so it's an econ one, and we'll be good.
Thank you, Dr. Thornton. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Again, my name is Cheri Sides. I'm in DBA 2. We're going to talk for a few minutes about factors that influence economic development. But before we get into that, I want to take a few minutes to say thank you to Dr. Thornton. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I am sure what little hair he has left, he wants to pull out as a result of the questions and the back and forth that we went through. To Dr. Agrawal and to Dr. Fordelli, thank you very, very much. I also want to acknowledge Dean Kankman and to Dr. Johansson in his absence, and for the rest of you, thank you for spending this few minutes with me as I present the research that I have done for the last few months and actually some years. Basically, as Dr. Thornton says, I'm an economist, and my interest in economics has been international economics, specifically development economics. And so this topic is near and dear to me because it is yet it's expanded my knowledge in this area that I'm really passionate about. And I'm passionate about it because I have come from humble beginnings, and I can identify with citizens in other countries that have come from humble beginnings. And so the question has always been for me, how do we get better? How do we improve our lifestyle, improve our lot in life, not just for ourselves, but also for those who ultimately become our children and our grandchildren. And if we do it just right, it can expand so that it's not just a generational thing, but ultimately becomes a societal issue. And so a societal change. And I wanted to be part of the solution. I want to be part of the solution. How can I impact and leave the world a little bit better than it was given to me? And how can I do it and be impactful for as many people as I possibly can? And so that was why I kind of went into economics, specifically development economics. And while it's international, there are some similarities here in the U.S., but my focus has been primarily on international and development economics. In economics, I tell my students that economics is the study of behavior, of business behavior, and is concerned mostly with production, consumption, and the transfer of wealth. And so this piece of my research is going to deal with the transfer of wealth and how do we accumulate and then transfer wealth or distribute wealth in a way that a whole economy or a whole society benefits. As a quantitative science, economics, traditional measures have been income-based. For example, gross domestic product, GDP, or gross national product, GNP. But there are some other forms of economic development measurements that include like GNP per capita, population, labor force, urbanization, and also consumption. I am choosing not to use those because they're limited in scope, primarily because they're income-based. And going back to why I got into economics, it's not enough to know the income aspect of an economy's development, but it is also about to what end? Why are we developing? To what end are we developing? And so it would always be about the well-being of those who live in that society. And so from a social science aspect, again, income-only measurements and indicators are incomplete. And because income does not accurately measure well-being, you can only draw an inference of well-being from income. Recent geopolitical events such as nationalism, ethnocentrism, fiscal austerity policies, recession, Brexit, Eurozone issues have made global interdependence tenuous and has stymied our economic development. And these economic activities have had a negative impact on the global community in the terms of international trade, which we're experiencing now with the prospective trade war between the U.S. and China. Labor force migration, which also includes refugee migration, and then we're also seeing it in the form of increased terrorist attacks. Within and outside of economics, we have used the term economic growth and economic development almost interchangeably and sometimes synonymously. For the purpose of this study, we're going to make distinctions between economic growth and economic development. The distinction that we're going to make is that economic growth is a feature of economic development. And so you have, as a result of economic development, you see economic growth. And so as long as going forward, what you'll notice that we're speaking specifically about those policies, those theories that make economic development possible. We're not specifically speaking to measuring economic growth. Economic growth, while it is quantitative and economic development is more qualitative, economic development is broader because not only does it include the income aspect, but it also includes the quality of life aspect, and it answers that question about well-being. So as a result of this, our goal is to discover and to seek to understand the trends in development in the hopes that policymakers will use the empirical evidence and create solutions and decision-making strategies which will promote further development. And we want the policymakers to make these further developments because, as I mentioned again to my students, it is, if we are looking at the economy as a pie, and we're dividing the pie up into pieces, yes, you can get a larger piece of the pie, but wouldn't it be better if you enlarge the pie? And so, for economic development, we don't want to only increase the pie size, the pie piece size. We actually want to expand the pie. This leads us to our problem statement, and the trends that I want to investigate are to determine to what extent the policies, to what extent will political, social, and economic activities impact economic development across countries. So let's talk a little bit more about economic development. Economic development answers the question, to what end should we be concerned about production, consumption, and wealth transfer? Kalubi and his colleagues began their study on economic development, or on the factors that impact economic development, by using economic globalization, entrepreneurship, and development, stipulating regions, countries, and cultures that are continuously integrated and interconnected, which has increased the standard of living for all of those who are concerned. Some more literature. F.C. Burbidge studied the Russian economy and determined that, was trying to determine why previous economic development programs were successful, and more successful than the current ones. And what he discovered was that using cross-sectional comparative analysis, that political factors impacted development. If those factors, the political factors, were negative, that would cause a deteriorating economic indicator, as evidenced by a deteriorating economic indicator. then the government would need to revise its priorities. And then Andre Viana also studied key factors of economic development, in particular international trade and geography, which was a hint to geographic determinism theory. And geographic determinism theory, in a nutshell, says that your geographical location determines whether or not you're going to be successful with your economic development programs. And he used as proof certain areas like the continent of Africa or Central or South America were less likely to have successful economic development programs as opposed to other countries. We were not going to delve too much into that, but what I wanted to pull out of his work was that, again, political factors seem to be a determining factor of economic development, and I'll explain later why that's important. Finally, for the purpose of time and in the interest of time here, Bennett, Ferreira, Gwatney, and Morales also did a study on factors of economic development, and their focus was on economic as opposed to political institutions. And their study was a post-colonial comparative perspective. And what they found relative to geography, relative to economic as opposed to political, was again geography played a role in economic development. They also found that overall economic growth does not equate to equitably distributed wealth. So you can have the growth, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it was distributed equitably. They concluded that it takes a collection of institutions, not just one, not just economic institutions, not just political, but a collection of all institutions that are mutually reinforcing to have a good economic development program. In short, much research, more research is necessary in this area to gain a greater understanding of the causes that would create economic development. And then also we need more research because a general consensus has proven to be elusive. There are multiple factors that have been studied, and again, more studies need to be done. My research contributes to economic development literature because one, it's global in scope. As I mentioned here, and usually when we're talking about economic development, we're looking at a specific region, sometimes a specific country. Mine is more global in nature. Also, I am I have an accumulation of institutions. So I'm looking at economic institutions, I'm looking at political institutions, and I'm also looking at social factors from social institutions, and that has not been previously done in previous literature. When we talk through about economic development, there are several indicators that can be used to measure economic development. The traditional ones, gross domestic product, gross national product. There are a few alternatives, such as physical quality of life, PQLI, which measures literacy, infant mortality, and life expectancy of 1-year-olds. This one, however, lacks theoretical explanation, which is why I did not choose it. There's the Genuine Progress Index, which measures economic growth, but not development, which is why I didn't choose that one. The Social Progress Index is another one. It measures the society's ability to meet basic human needs. Its focus is on education, human rights, the environment, and justice. I did not choose this one primarily because trying to find a way to quantify like environment and justice. I could have used some indices, but especially with the environment, it would have been a little bit more difficult to quantify that for the purpose of research. There's also another index called the Wellbeing Index, It's comprised of surveys which focus on social media, on the community, on geographical location, on health, learning, and economic opportunities. I didn't choose this one because it is subjected to the inclinations of the subjects that you're using to study. And then the final one that was another indicator, which is the indicator I chose, is the Human Development Index. There are several key advantages to using it, primarily because it's more comprehensive than the traditional GDP, GNP. It was first introduced in 1990 by Misbah al-Haq and Amartya Sen, and they decided, they created this and index as a way to start the conversation about human development. And so their purpose was not just to be comparative, but to look at the results, to look at the comparisons and say, what's next? And so we'll talk through a little bit more about that. The Human Development Index is comprised of 3 different indices: health, education, and standard of living. It was, and we'll go into that a little bit, each one individually a little bit later. To date, the Human Development Index has gone through 7 revisions and 2 iterations. And I have here, as you can see, the 2 iterations. The initial one was done in 1990. As far as the measurement, it started out as an additive aggregation function, just an arithmetic mean of the 3, each one given equal emphasis, equal weight, excuse me. And then in 2010, the United Nations Development Program changed the measurement standard and made it a multiplicative function, which is a geometric mean, giving it some similar weighting, but we switched from additive to multiplicative. The literary chronology of the Human Development Index, or HDI, is really, really short. Since its inception, there's about 10 years worth of literature that deals specifically with the validity of HDI itself. And then after that, it kind of diverged into 2 different paths, the literature. And so the literature either went towards a critical analysis of the components of HDI, or it went into how to apply HDI to countries, and then to make comparisons among the countries. In the spirit of the creator, what I am proposing to do is to center HDI rather than to critically compare it. So I'm centering it, making it the response variable, and I'll speak to that in the methodology. And by centering it, I'm able to discuss political, economic, and social factors that policymakers could eventually use to create policy, and then also to have research-based decision-making strategies. So, since HDI is my chosen economic development measure, primarily because of its components, and its components include not just an income component, but it also has a quality of life elements. Again, based on the latest iteration of it, we're talking through a geometric mean of 3 indices. Those 3 indices are life expectancy, which measures health. It is education, and it is also income, which measures standard of living. So that to illustrate how HDI is measured and calculated, I'm going to use the United States in 2016 to show you how it is calculated and then how we use that going forward in our research. To understand economic development for U.S. citizens, we looked at 3 areas: life expectancy, for health, education, and income. To assign an index score for life expectancy, first, United Nations created a standard age range of 20 to 85. And so life expectancy for any country in the world is somewhere between 20 and 85 years. That's the standard. And then the assumption is that the longer the life, the higher the score. So on this part of the indices, if you see a high score close to 1, then you know that the life expectancy is high. This is a good thing. What I did was I went to the World Health Organization for the United States, and they calculated that the average life expectancy in the U.S. in 2016 was 79.3 years. And so when you do the mathematical calculation between the range of 20 and 85 with the lifespan of 79.3, your score comes out to be 0.98, which is high and is good. From there, the second index is the education index. Here, the United Nations had as this measures the level of years attained in schooling. And the United Nations said that that standard number should be 15 years. In 2016, the United States years of schooling was 12. And so when you compare that to the standard, you have 0.8, and that 12 was from World Masters. And so you have, in the U.S., World Masters says that 12 years is what was typical school attainment. United Nations said 15 should be it, so our score for education is 0.8. And then our third index is the income index. This is how we measure standard of living. For this score, the gross national income, GNI, per capita was used. GNI is the annual income of a typical person based on purchasing power parity. And a purchasing power parity is a person's ability to buy goods and services at the same price as someone in a different country. And the theory behind this is that over time, when you compare the countries over time, eventually you've reached parity in that the price that you're paying will be the same. In this equation, we use a log scale to show decrease in purchasing power that allows for that over time reaching parity. And according to the World Bank, GNI per capita in the U.S. for 2016 was $58,030. The UN standard range is $100 minimum and $75,000 maximum. And so when we do this calculation, again, we using the law, we will come up with a score of 0.96. And then, so you take the three scores from life expectancy, education, and income index, multiply that, you will get 0.76. Then you cube root that, and you get 0.91. So to interpret the human development index for the United States in 2016 would be 0.9125, which is close to 1. So we say it's very high. And that's a good thing. Basically what happens here is we would do this for every country if we were doing a comparison, which is what a lot of the literature now exists is about. I'm going to do a little bit more than that. This leads to my research question to ask whether social, economic, and political factors do in fact significantly increase economic development. We cannot assume that all factors significantly impact, but it is important for us to determine which ones do, because it again allows policymakers to take this and make data-driven decisions and create research-based policies. Also, from an individual non-policymaker standpoint. This is important because as a citizen in a highly developed nation, there is this expectation that to whom much is given, much is required in the form of foreign aids or other types of assistance. And if we have countries that are not performing well or not have a lower HDI, then it is given that we are more likely to have to assist them to get them to a level of development. And if we can find ways for these countries, lesser developed countries, to develop organically, internally, that takes some of the burden off of the more developed nations. To determine whether social, economic, and political factors influence economic development, I have chosen 8 explanatory variables. They were selected to represent the 3 areas, which were based on universally accepted and relevant contemporary issues. For the social factor, I'm using total fertility rate, and I expect that there is a significantly and negative effect on economic development. For the economic factors, I've chosen income inequality, and I expect there to be a negative effect. Economic freedom, I'm expecting there to be a positive effect. Foreign direct investment, which is the investments that are coming from other countries, I'm expecting that to be positive. There's the labor migration, I'm expecting that to also be positive. Foreign aid, I'm expecting to be negative, and commodity dependence, I'm also expecting to be negative. And then here's the other ones. And then armed violent conflict or terrorism, I'm expecting that there is a significant and negative effect on economic development. Based on these hypotheses, my proposed model is here. I am using an econometric model, which was developed to regress the variables to ascertain relationships. And as you can see, my response variable is the Human Development Index, which is measuring economic development, and my explanatory variables are the social, economic, and political factors that I think will have some type of impact on economic development. My sample size is for the study is N equals 180, representing 188 countries that are recognized by the United Nations. I chose data for the year 2016. I'm using secondary data, which was gathered from a variety of prestigious and reputable sources. Concerning my methodology, the most common concerns that I anticipate with my cross-sectional data, I'm using cross-sectional data, would be multicollinearity and heteroscedasticity. To account for those common concerns, I am planning to use the variance inflation factor to test for multicollinearity. I'm also anticipating using White's test and also residual analysis to cover heteroscedasticity and any other problems that I think should arise, I anticipate arising. Again, I chose this topic because, again, it's part of what I've been doing since my master's study. I am a proponent of if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, he feeds himself for a lifetime. And so I want to be a part of the solutions that are created around the world that will just because it's better for them, but because it's better for everyone involved. If you have any questions?
I have a question. Could you go to your problem statement at the beginning? And it's really admirable, both the topic and, your sentiments and all that. And I appreciated that and really like that. It just seemed really broad to me. It just, I mean, again, it's not even criticism. It just feels like a really, really broad topic to address in terms of, and I know it's not your, it doesn't directly impact your model, but maybe you can explain to me how the results of your study will, address something that feels a little more specific, some specific takeaway that we might get from the results of your study.
Actually, I see this as the start of, it's more foundational.
Mm-hmm.
I see this as literally as the foundation for future work. It may appear to be broad, only because, of the topic, but you will be able to, from it, I want the reader, who I anticipate are policymakers, to look at it and say, where do I fit in here? That's where I fit in. And they can pull that piece out of it. And by doing that, they are also mindful that when I pull this piece out of it, it's still going to have an effect on some of these other areas. So previous literature would focus primarily just on economic institutions or the economic piece of it, to the exclusion of social or political. And what ends up happening, what we see a lot in economics, is when policymakers or make a decision and they're saying, I'm going to make a decision, I'm going to cut taxes because I want to do this, and they don't see what the other unintended consequences are. And so that was why I chose to approach it this way.
So is it sort of like Hofstede in the sense that you're going to have an index of all these different, factors created around, in his case, it was around, highly individualistic, social systems, and then that impacted the economy and that kind of thing, versus, and then there was indexes and you could compare between countries. Is that where you're going?
It would lend itself that way, yes. It could lend itself that way, yes.
So then, moving more specifically, then I know a little bit about Japan, and there, we have these 2 lost decades that have happened, declining population, and no increases in GDP. You've been talking about some of these things, and yet there's no changes in their immigration policy, and my sociology behind all of this is in their case that things actually are pretty good, but they don't want to extend themselves out, even though 100, 200,000 Filipino nurses could be hired in a minute, and it would really help those Filipino nurses because of the income difference, and it wouldn't hurt the Philippines at all. I mean, so I'm trying to use a specific example because actually that's been a point of debate in Japan. Is that is some things that you're studying, are they going to address some of these kinds of issues in some way, or is it somehow going to give insight to some of this kind of thing?
We'll touch on, my research will touch on that, but again, basically what I didn't want to happen was a siloed approach.
Mm-hmm.
Because well-being does not exist in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
And so while the research would lend itself that way, and if a Japanese policymaker read my research, they could glean that from, and that might be just what they need in order for them to consider bringing Filipino nurses in. By the same token, another country will take it and look at it and say, oh, I can grab this as well. So it could lend itself that way, but eventually, in future research, I could move and say, well, based on what I've done here, let's drill down a little bit further here.
So how would then your research result in, as you say, let's call it more insightful economic development?
This is just to set the stage to get the conversation going.
Okay. So your model then, actually, then the research that you're actually doing, the econometrics, the model, once you run your model, what are the results? I mean, what's the outcome of that? Can you go back to your model and maybe explain to us a little bit?
Okay, so with the model, I'm expecting, I'm looking at to what extent these factors, income inequality, economic freedom, what they have on human development.
Okay.
And so when I run the model with the
Yeah.
data that's given, when I look at the results, I can say, oh yeah, okay, so I thought that income inequality would have a significantly statistic and negative relationship to HDI. And so if I'm a country that has a high rate of income inequality, then I can look at this and say, okay, I see that this is true in this case, based on the additional, research that will be presented in the dissertation, which includes some recommendations as to what, some directions in which you can go. Then those countries that would have that problem could look at it and say, well, if I have this problem, how could I go about what policies can I create that would increase my HDI, which in essence would be better for my citizens.
Okay, so just theorizing, how would the Republic of Congo's numbers be different than the United States? Using your model, just guessing. We're not looking for.
Because I haven't done that portion of it yet. I would expect income inequality. I would expect the difference to be greater in the Congo. Not to say that there wouldn't be any income inequality in the United States, but if the Congo is looking at this, then they can look not only at what is the political structure, what is their political institutions, how are they set up, and what can we do to tweak them. They can look at their economic infrastructure and their economic institutions, what can we do to tweak that, and then also look at the social that would also see and pull all of it together, because again, if we have a collective, how does all of that work together so that we can improve? And again, when we're doing the comparison, this would be, I'm in the Congo dealing with Congolese. I'm in the U.S. dealing with U.S. citizens. It's only economists that do the cross-sectional. The individual countries are more concerned with what's going on in their country.
So each of those factors on the right, you have the equivalent of, again, I'm not an economist, so I'm just, are those, you going to have indexes connected to that at the end of this, or?
No.
You say those variables are studied.
Yes, okay, so income inequality is a Gini coefficient. Economic freedoms is actually an index. Total fertility rate is not an index. Armed violent conflict is the number, is not an index. Foreign direct investment is a dollar amount. Labor migration is a population percentage. Foreign aid is also a dollar amount, and commodity dependence is also a dollar amount as a percentage. And so it's not all indexes, and there's only maybe two that are actually indexes.
Thank you.
I was a little surprised to hear you say that nobody's examined political and social impacts on.
Not that they haven't, they've just done it in isolation. So
I can think of a couple of examples in the literature off the top of my head that were presented to you in my class, in fact, that don't seem to appear here. You know,
Such as?
Kana and Palepu. 3 articles by Kana and Palepu all address this very issue in the context of institutional voids and the impact of institutional voids on business environments.
Yes,
In,
economics.
that's right, this is an
Right,
this is in
right.
an economic context.
Right, what I was saying was not that no literature existed, but that usually it was in isolation and did not include other areas. So it would have been strictly economics, or strictly social, or strictly
Well,
political.
the observation that I would make is that your assessment is inaccurate, because what they're assessing, what they examine, like I said, are institutional voids that exist in the political realm, in the social realm, in the context of the functioning of various institutions in developing economies.
I will have to revisit those and,
You know, also,
into that.
you know, further to that point, there's a literature book by Mahajan and Banga, William Easterly, that also addressed this very same issue. And those are quite well known. And then I look at this, your proposed model, and I kind of wonder what it is new and different that you're bringing to this, to your study. Because, you know, I'm not an economist, and I think, you know, these are easily, I guess it's, my take on it really is so what? I think these have already been identified in a number of different locations, and I'm kind of curious about what it is that, what's new about this research?
As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, what's new about it is that previous literature has looked at these, or combinations of these, from a regional. So if I'm looking at Latin America, or I'm looking at a specific country, whereas I'm looking at it worldwide or global in its entirety.
Well, if you're looking at it in a global context, you know, I just wonder how effective that could be, considering that the vast majority of the world's countries probably don't have things like armed violent conflict. So what does that say about, you know, human development in some place like the U.S. if there's no relationship between?
I would argue, if you're using the U.S. as an example, I would argue about armed violent conflict, whether or not it exists in the U.S. But in
what sense?
In the data, we were looking at internal as well as external. So whether or not it was an
So what's an example of internal armed violent conflict?
mass shootings, whether it was in a public setting. That
So
would be one example.
when you say armed violent conflict, who are the parties in conflict in the mass shooting?
It's internal.
What does that mean? It's civil war?
It would be one citizen creating or
So
imposing
it kind of begs the
another.
question, you know, if you have, you know, an incident, for example, such as the one down in South Florida, where you have somebody that, you know, arguably a disturbed individual with an assault rifle kills 14 people.
Mhm.
Is that the same phenomenon as an individual in someplace like Congo who kills 14 people because that individual is a part of the militia?
I think
Is
this,
that both
loss of life,
both of those
yes, loss
armed
of
violent
life,
conflict?
loss of life. Loss of life. The motivation,
I think that's, I would question the logic of that. of how you're constructing your variable. You know, so I think that similarly, things like labor migration, certainly that could be a powerful economic force. In some places, I think you could make the observation that, you know, it simply reflects, you know, functioning economies. That you've got people who are migrating for jobs, and that's a perfectly acceptable thing. They're going where the opportunity is, and on the other hand, in other contexts, it's, you know, a different type of pursuit. For example, fleeing economies that aren't functioning. So I think, you know, if you have variables that are really sort of contingent on the social context in which they're operating, you've got to figure out a way to deal with this.
Maybe the economists could speak up and help us here.
Well, I thought we weren't supposed to say anything.
No, you are,
Oh.
for sure. For sure, please say something, both of you, or either of you, just to help us understand, because this is a proposal, not a defense. So we're really just exploring, you know, the model. It could be ironclad, and I'm not an economist. Doug, you know, has his own issues.
I'm not an economist either.
Well, he has his own, you know,
I do have my own
concerns and things, and I had some questions that you answered, but I guess my question is, from a economic model standpoint, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of this model? I think that's
Are you looking for me to?
yeah.
Well, from my perspective, having looked, this is not 100% my area, but all the
Right.
research I did, that there does not appear to be any model specified exactly like this one is. So I would characterize this particular specification as unique. And by specification, I mean the mix of independent variables in the model.
I think we discussed this issue, actually. This is a very good question. I know that we talked about the fact that maybe there are a lot of similar studies out there. And talking with Barry, I think final assessment was that this is unique the way she's approaching it. But obviously, this is not a unique topic. It's a topic that there has been numerous studies in this area. But also, she can maybe do a lot of creative things. For example, when we look at a variable like fertility rate with a minus sign as it relates to Human Development Index, you brought up a very good question about Japan. Maybe in Japan you can maybe dig into it and say maybe this is an exception where fertility rate there may have a positive impact rather than a negative impact, because this is why they are concerned about it. That's why people from Philippines, Thailand, and other places come to Japan as nurses and physicians. But in general, I agree with Barry that we looked into it. We thought that this really, in terms of the way the model is developed, is unique.
Yeah, I'd also say like a variable like total fertility rate. When you look at models where that variable is not used, it does a very poor job explaining the values of Human Development Index in sub-Saharan Africa. But when you put that variable in, the expenditure of the model is much higher. And so as a sort of policy implication will be that some sort of educational program to reduce family size are going to be very, very valuable in those countries.
What about something like foreign aid?
Oh, that's one of the variables, isn't it?
Yeah, so, but that's, if you're examining these on a global scale, which I understand to mean, you know, not just looking at developing economies or emerging economies, how is that going to provide
Well, you have to have
any
very- you have to have
explanatory
very-
value in a developed country?
to determine the impact of an independent variable on the dependent variable, there has to be variation. So they can't all be high 4 and 8, some have to be high and some have to be low. Like for example, if you did a study, I'm just going to make up 2 variables. Exam score and study time, whoever studied the same amount of time, you couldn't really tell what was going on. As a matter of fact, it's more valuable to have a lot of variability in the independent variables to explain the variation of the dependent variable.
That's helpful, thank you. That's really helpful for me.
Have you considered other variables like transparency?
Transparency is captured in economic freedom
Economic
is an index that has 10 separate components. Sir?
I said, what's in the economic
Okay,
freedom
so
index?
that's an index number that's generated by the Heritage Foundation. And if you look at it, there's indices like, for example, dealing with international trade, like tariff rates and stuff like that. There's indices dealing with regulatory issues. There's indices dealing with labor market freedom. And so if you were to get on the Heritage Foundation webpage, the Economic Freedom Index consists of 10 separate indices, which incidentally, I did look at all those indices and run them separately.
If you're interested in examining the political and social impacts, there is political freedom index as well.
Well, see, now you're making a positive contribution.
Well, I'm trying. And, you know, so.
And who is that?
Sabula has done something on that too.
I can't think of it offhand,
So-
but I know, I remember.
That'd be
I
very,
think it's
very valuable.
there are 3 components to it. One's like freedom, press freedom,
Right, that'd be very valuable.
You know,
to have.
you know, the ability of citizens to participate in the political process. So the 3 or 4
This is, this is a well-researched area and very highly researched because it's so important. And there's many, many models out there. It's this particular combination of independent variables together that gives the model uniqueness.
That's what sets it apart.
There was another one of those that globalization index. AT Kearney has a globalization index that might be.
You're really making a difference today, Randy.
Yeah.
You said it's the
Well, those are
global.
globalization index. And, you know, I think among the things that are measured in that is like, you know, the intensity of international communications, relationships like that.
No,
So that might also be something.
no,
Yeah, that
once
is-
you start adding all those other variables, then multilinearity becomes a real
Yeah,
possible.
I think that is
problem.
covered under freedom index, economic freedom, because
Economic
when you look at economic freedom, one aspect of it is to be able to basically engage in international trade freedom. That is, and then it itself, there are 10 indicators, but each has 50 sort of indicators. I think international trade and globalization at least is a
It's
part of
within
that.
part of
Yeah.
economic freedom.
Well, I think, I agree that those other indices would be well worth examining. And that's just a question of collecting the data and
Yeah, I think that there's an argument to be made in the context of knowledge transfer that influencing economic development. And those might be ways to operationalize that.
you mean across countries.
Between,
Well, if you have a suggestion, no?
I just made a couple of suggestions.
You're all tapped out?
Well, you know, I don't really want to, I'm not an economist here, so, you know,
Well, those points are very well taken. And I think the model could be improved by adding those variables. And that, and if it turns out that they're not related to the human development, that will show up as insignificant in the regression results, and you can appeal to the fact that, well, we thought that theoretically there could be some relationship here, but as a matter of fact, when we did the analysis using the data, it turned out not to be so.
you know, I wonder if you wanted to control the population.
A lot of things are per capita.
Yes, yeah. Foreign aid, foreign.
Yeah, it's foreign aid per capita.
Foreign aid.
Yeah, foreign direct investment per capita.
Yes, sir. Or foreign direct investments percent of GDP.
Yes.
Well, you know, I think that you'd find, if you examine foreign direct investment, that, you know, market size is very influential in terms of.
Well, it could be run both ways, once again.
So one more comment that I have from what little I know about the periphery of this. Some of these factors, your human development index, I don't understand it like an economist, so I can't comment. But there is a lot of interesting stuff around what's called entrepreneurial ecosystems. And a lot of that stuff on the right, these explanatory variables studied, a number of those, including some of the things mentioned that aren't on there, freedom and other things, play into some of the studies done related to an entrepreneurial, quote, ecosystem.
There's an entrepreneurship element in the economic freedom. Index.
Is there? Okay,
Yes.
good. It's, I just mentioned that because then the natural result of this is, oh, well, not only do you understand the Human Development Index as you've defined it, but it also, as sort of a systemic finding, is that it also gives you insights into the entrepreneurial ecosystem or how to better, guide policymakers that way. Now, that's the assumption that a good economic ecosystem is a good and not a bad. But I mean, assuming you take that assumption, then there is something there. But I really appreciated the comments from not only Cheri but from the dissertation.
Yeah, I thought we were supposed to leave it in her hands.
No, I think really at this stage, I think at the defense, Dr. Thornton, it's a very fair thing to make sure at the defense that, you gotta, but in terms of, creating and making this as strong
And I think your observations and those of Dr. Johansson are very, very valuable, and I think I'll try our very best to incorporate them into the model. I think I most appreciate it, actually.
Good. Anything else? Cheri, thank you for...
Yeah, I can't speak for the rest of the committee, but I'm satisfied with this, and I think with the modifications you suggested,
I'll try to remember what those
that would be so valuable if you could. Yeah, because, I'm a bag shaker for way back. So, I like to throw them in there and see what happens when you run them out.
The 1820 one is that's the globalization one, but the political freedoms, I don't know if that's Transparency International.
They were one of our sources.
Transparency
is one of our sources for one of the variables.
Yeah.
They have a very good corruption index, by the way.
Yes.
But, once again, like many of the things like the corruption index, there's a corruption index embedded in the economic freedom index, and the problem with that is, if you run them both together, there's some multi-similarity.
And that was one of the issues.
But if you could email those suggestions to both Cheri and I, that would be great, if you could do that. But
Sure, could you just go back to the slide you had on the map for the U.S. Economic Development Index? No, the only, on the life expectancy, I may be totally, bad at my math, but I get, 59.3 over 65 on that.
Cheri?
Say it again?
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay. So,
I got like 0.91.
oh, you mean when you did the calculation?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, I'm just
say
thinking if you roll this out to other audiences, if you build in the
I
hardware.
thought you were asking about the nature of what it meant.
No, I just did a quick and dirty on the math to see if I understood it.
Right, so
For which one?
Well, if I take 79.3 minus 20, I get 59.3 over 85 minus 20, it's 65. That's not 0.98.
Right, correct.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a calculator, but I do agree with that. That's a
Yeah.
little bit.
I'll check to make sure.
Yeah.
Check on that one, yeah.
So I just say,
Yeah.
they had the math nailed if you roll that out.
Yeah, I agree 100%,
I'm
absolutely.
not a math guy.
Yeah.
I didn't even look, I gotta be honest with you. Yeah, but it seems unlikely that the ratio of 59.3 to 65 to be 0.98. As a matter of fact,
Right.
65 over 60, that's 12, 13, so that's like 0.93.
Yeah, that's what they want, what they want.
Would you have a calculator?
Well, on my phone.
Freedom House, publishes.
Can you send?
Yeah, I'll send that. Also, I see the Cato Institute publishes.
Right. Yeah, there's no, which I think really points out what a big topic this is. There's no shortage of indexes and data sets collected to look into this stuff. And so the notion that there'd be like this one super model that can explain everything, we're all just trying to come up with the best model we can. And when you talk about so many variables, the chance that one model would have all the variables inside of it is pretty slim.
I have nothing to contribute in terms of economics or these indexes. But
John, don't let that stop you.
yeah, well, I want to get in my 2 cents too. Just as a practical question, how much time do you feel like to devote to this in order to then to get to a finished product? Because the scope seems really significant. You're using a lot of variables, and I mean, I'm just trying to. How much time are you going to devote to this, and how big do you think this dissertation is going to be?
I've already started, especially with just like collecting the data, and doing preliminary reading. And so far, I have devoted, at a minimum of about 8 hours, 3 times a week.
Yeah.
Well, you just looked at a lot of stuff to
Yeah.
talk about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, you do have a lot
That's
of
what-
stuff.
yeah,
That's
that's
yeah.
And what do you expect to see? I think that's the way to go.
Your idea is it's so
And I
wide.
did do-
Yeah, that was my, you know, is it just,
I don't
is it
think
just-
The topic, economic
Oh,
development.
this is broad.
Itself
Yeah,
is broad,
right.
Yeah.
no,
I'm
I
looking
just, I
specifically
don't
at
know.
these. I'm just looking specifically at those, at looking specifically at HDI and then specifically those 8. And so,
I was just saying, just a lit review on all those indexes is going to be a
And
really,
then think about every
monster.
variable has to be discussed, like how's it calculated and what's a revenue.
Exactly.
it will be a
But to
large
me, that's a
document.
blessing because plenty to write about.
Yeah, that's true.
Good question.
And on top of that, if you want to write about examples, there you go.
Yeah.
You got so much room
Right.
to write how this might apply.
And it
In
would make
certain
sense
situations.
to, do the overall model, then select maybe 1 or 2 countries that are very,
Yeah.
very different. And I'll give you an example of a country that's very different is Cuba. They have a relatively high HDI, but their economic freedom is very low.
Mhm.
So it'd be like, could give you a chance to bring some of these other countries in and talk about things like that.
yeah, I'm just saying, is this,
It'll be a lot.
because I think, we want to do so much and it's such an area and we want to make an impact on this. And then is it doable in terms of for the sake of a dissertation?
The good thing is most of the data is secondary, so data collection,
Oh, no, I'm just talking about the write-up.
writing
Yeah,
is quite an effort, yeah.
Yeah,
But see, I view that as a plus, plenty to write about.
absolutely.
Well, the worst situation to be in is I got nothing to say.
Oh, yeah. And
But
this
you,
is-
but you economists are rarely in that situation.
Well,
Maybe you statisticians don't.
I'm noted for my brevity.
I agree. Cheri, very nice, thank you, and thank you, dissertation chair.